All right, guys, joining us today is a neuroscientist, author, and inventor of the Precognition Method. He is on a mission to translate cutting-edge neuroscience into practical techniques that are applicable in real-world, personal, and professional environments. He has been featured in multi-award-winning documentaries, and his Precognition Method has been applied in award-winning leadership programs. He is also the best-selling author of Hidden World, The Inside Story of the Soul, as well as a newly released children's book, The Adventures of K-Man the Explorer. He completed his PhD in neuroimaging genetics at the Department of Psychiatry, Westmead Hospital, investigating neuroimaging biomarkers that are genetically upstream to cognitive processes and neuropsychiatric conditions. He now employs his simple yet effective methods to help individuals and corporate teams who are suffering from performance addiction, burnout, overwhelm, stress, anxiety, and depression. His Precognition Method teaches how to thrive in the era of rapid change, complexity, and ambiguity by taking the guesswork out of hustle and exhaustive strategies and learning how to work with the precision of the moment. So with that, I'd love to welcome in Dr. Kaushik Ram. Thanks for joining us today, Kaushik.
Yeah, wonderful to be here.
And so Les has given us a bit of background on you, I guess, Kaushik, but what we'd love to do is invite you to share your origin story. Feel free to go back as far as you'd like to go, as much detail as you'd like. We'd love to hear where you've come from and what you've done to come to be the Kaushik of today. So if you'd love to share with us, please, the floor is yours.
Yeah, sure. So I guess there are many threads to my background, and I think the most obvious one that people look at is my neuroscience background. And the way that journey started was I had very early experiences in investigating the mind. I had always inquired about the thought processes that occur. And one of the main questions I was asking at a very young age, in my even before my teenage years, was where do thoughts come from? And the grown-ups around me were never able to give me a satisfactory answer to that. So I did take it upon myself to investigate that. And I was lucky enough to come across literature which talked about meditation very early on in my teenage years as well. So that immediately put me as a different person to the people who are around me, because I understood something about the mind which people around me weren't responding to. And so earlier on, I studied biology. I looked at animal behavior and physiology, and for my master's, I actually ended up working with sharks. I was actually doing brain surgery on sharks. And that was my entry point into neuroscience. So when I did start doing medical research, I already had a background in both how the mind decides to think, as well as a neurosurgery background. And so for my PhD, I did neuropsychiatry, got exposed to a lot of different mental health conditions. And looked at psychiatry, depression, anxiety, stress, schizophrenia. I was working with kids with ADHD. So I had a very, in-depth journey into neuropsychiatry. And from there, I went on to lead projects at the University of Sydney, where I finished my PhD. And the last project I was working on was looking at neurology and using AI to diagnose various neurological conditions. So neurological conditions are a little bit different from psychiatric conditions, which are mental health related. Neurological conditions are more genetic, for example. So you got things like dementia, you've got Alzheimer's disease, stroke, epilepsy. All of these are neurological conditions rather than mood-related or affective disorders. So when I talk about neuroscience, I've had quite a broad bandwidth that I've covered with all the different areas that I've explored, from neurosurgery, neuropsychiatry, and neurology. So that's a bit of my neuroscience background. So yeah, that's what has led me to where I am now.
So thanks so much, man. And there's a lot that I want to unpack there. There's obviously a very rich sort of exposure to that scientific world that you've sort of delved into and have sort of made your foundation to this point. But something, I guess, that you mentioned about your early years, it really piqued my interest, and I'd love for you to expand a little bit on this. And maybe it's because of my personal interest in meditation, and because I'm a meditation teacher, I run programs and all that sort of thing. But you mentioned that I guess you had some early exposure to questioning things that are a little bit different to the people around you, and put you in a space of maybe perhaps like a different sort of paradigm of thinking to everyone else, and inclusive of, I guess, the whole, I guess, notion of meditation. I assume that back then it was less of a mainstream thing than it is seen to be now. And having that sort of foundation as well, going into the very, Western mode of thinking with neuroscience, how does that sort of, I guess, differ, and how did that, I guess, affect your professional work and your professional studies and things like this?
Yeah, so because I've had an experience with meditation prior to entering neuroscience, when I did enter, the hard science, I always was different in that environment. So I'd be working around psychiatrists and psychologists, and quite often I could see where the shortcomings were, but no one wanted to listen to me. Because even if they did, they refused to acknowledge a different point of view because their jobs depended on it. So it was quite an interesting time in my life where I was on this path of self-discovery while simultaneously questioning my own career pathway. And for anyone who's sort of studied psychiatry or psychology, if they don't have a background in how the mind works from outside the science field, they will have no conflict of interest. But because I had multiple angles that I was coming at, I always felt conflicted. And not taking away from the spiritual I guess bandwagon as well, which also I didn't quite resonate with. There's so many spiritual trends that start and fade, and it has its own evolution. And for me to really come into my own integrity meant that I neither belonged to science nor to spirituality. I had to carve out my own path, my own way of understanding things. So I didn't follow anyone. And to this day, I've had many bodies of knowledge, but I don't subscribe to any. Instead, I've decided on creating my own. And that's a very unique way of looking at the world. So similar to when I was growing up, I wasn't satisfied with the answers that were given to me. That has led me onto this path of creating my own answers to the questions that I had in the first place.
Yeah, it's super interesting, man. And I feel like it's quite a I guess that there's like inherently some level of curiosity that I'm sensing in you. There's always been that, I feel, and like you haven't sort of rested with what you've been told necessarily because it didn't click into place for you necessarily, right? Maybe the way that more accepting people will simply just say, okay, this is the knowledge that has been fed to me, so that, and I'll understand it, I'll take it at face value. But there was, I guess, an internal conflict within you. And I'd love for you to expand a little bit on that conflict that you had within yourself because like, it's interesting that you had that, like you said, right at the time during your, I guess, your studies, which is heavily sort of skewed towards that Western way of thinking. But then you had everything else in between, that like foundational understanding that sort of draws counter to that. So I'd love to hear more about the conflicts that you dealt with there, and what exactly were they, and like, how did you sort of see them through, and then, like you said, like pave your own path of understanding.
Yeah, so what's been very fortunate is that science did provide me with a very thorough methodology of looking at different ideas and being able to think critically. So in order to produce any body of work in science, it has to be done through critical thinking, which allows a new body of knowledge to come forth. Otherwise, you're simply repeating what someone else has done. And that's not science, that is, plagiarism, basically. So from a very young age, from writing my master's thesis to my PhD thesis, these are all original bodies of work. So that whole idea of thinking for myself from a very young age and consuming information, but then articulating it in various different ways and deconstructing it and putting it back together, similar to how an engineer would do when they're young, they're playing with their toys, they break it down, look at all the mechanical elements, and then they put it back together. And then they go, oh, wow, like I can change a few things here, I can make it better. And, they might grow up modifying cars and things like that. But that is the type of logic that I applied to thought as well, which then meant that I could be a craftsman of thought. And that process basically allowed me to not just look at the science, but also, areas in spirituality through that lens. And for that reason, many people in, I guess, the conscious and spiritual areas did not like me, because the moment I questioned something, it upset them because it challenged their paradigm, something that they believed in so strongly. And, it goes for the people who believe in Joe Dispenza or Bruce Lipton or any of the spiritual, icons that exist today. When I challenge people upon their thoughts, it actually, shakes their foundation, because sometimes our beliefs are built on fragile egos. And quite often when you shake the foundation a little bit, if it's fragile, then it's likely to collapse. And then that is where a lot of people do become very defensive of their ideas. For myself, I often welcome challenges. So if anyone looks at my work and criticizes it, that's always very useful, provided it's constructive criticism, other than just, blatant dismissal of the work. So because of that, my body of work has constantly matured and evolved based on how people have challenged it. And I always welcome that. So that's, already puts this body of work quite differently to, providing a set body of knowledge and saying this is the way the world operates.
That's really interesting. And I think really important for people to think about in how they approach things, period. I would agree that, the majority of experiences people have when their challenge is to become defensive. And I just want to point out that what you mentioned about, being linked to the ego is definitely why I think that is. And also because a lot of people attach their identity to certain beliefs that they hold. And then when you challenge that, it's kind of like you're challenging who they are and who they've chosen to be. And they don't really like that, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So because I've encountered that quite a lot, I've realized that exactly what you said, like because people believe in their thoughts so much that when it gets threatened, it is like a life-threatening situation because their ego is their identity, is who they are. So by threatening their thoughts, you're threatening who they are. And so the same survival response occur, whether it be just a simple challenge or a life-threatening situation.
Mm. And it makes me, there was something I came across, some of your work that is coming to mind now, which was the power of choice. And you discuss how it actually comes down to the rhythm of your heart, right? And that there's a space between, a cause and effect. And something that Les and I talk about, we would love to get your, your view on it and your explanation, because you've got a whole lot more knowledge and experience in that field. But it's something I'd love for you to talk about if you could, because I think in that space, if we are challenged or our beliefs are challenged, if we have knowledge of that space and know that we do have a choice of how we respond, we could come out with a different belief or actually start to go down that critical thinking process. So would you be able to talk about that and how that relates to what we're discussing now?
Yeah, so I do talk a lot about choice in relationship to the heart. And, often a lot of people think that the choice is made by the mind, but you can simply look at all the physiological changes that happen even before information enters our subconscious, let alone our conscious perception. So, the pupils might dilate, you might have sweaty palms, your heart rate may rise. All these are physiological changes in response to what is happening around you. So if someone's making a decision, if they're already in a heightened state, the decision-making process can be quite overwhelming because they're already quite, agitated. So what they would tend to do is make short-term decisions, a quick fix, for example. It could be something as simple as, should I go out tonight or not? And if it's coming out of a place of lack, then you fill in that emptiness. So the decision is made based on an agitation or an emptiness, rather than if your heart rate slowed down and you're calm. And in that moment, you have all the time in the world to think about the decision, look at everything different angles. And this is where the critical thinking comes in. And so because you have all the time in the world to contemplate a decision, you're able to feel, what your gut is saying or what your heart is saying, and then combine it with all the retrospective knowledge that you have gained to make an informed decision. So that's the difference between, simply reacting with the mind and responding with the heart.
Yeah, and that's definitely something that Shaun and I talk about quite a bit, the difference between reaction and response is a subtle difference, but obviously there's more of a, like you said, an informed conscious choice that's being made rather than something that more seems like a reflexive action, which is sort of to, like you said, to remove oneself from a state of essentially discomfort, right? And I guess that's sort of that sort of runs with, I guess, the function of the body and the nervous system and things like this to keep us, quote unquote, safe and things like this. Would that be correct to say?
Yeah, absolutely. So the nervous system governs a lot of the processes even before it reaches our subconscious. And that is the place where the subconscious decides what is relevant or what is important. And by the time that information reaches your conscious perception, your body has already made a decision. And so this is where the conflict of interest arises, right? Because people's body may say one thing, but someone's thoughts, beliefs, ideologies may conflict with that. So a lot of the work that I do is actually harmonizing the body into a state where it does feel safe, it does feel that it is secure and confident. And the confidence really comes from an internal alignment between brain and body, because there is no internal conflict of interest, there is no crisis of fate. And so you're able to give full conviction into any decision you make, into any action you take. So everything is deliberate, everything is intentional, rather than, sort of half in, half out. People who sit on the fence are procrastinating because they're overwhelmed by choices. And so the ability to take action is diluted as well.
Would you be able to talk a bit more on that in terms of the alignment of the heart and the mind, and then making decisions? Because I think, the procrastination and being overwhelmed by choice is something I've definitely experienced. And I know a lot of people do experience. And then I've noticed when I have been able to slow down, now that I think about it, it is really the alignment of your heart and your mind, and being able to make a decision that feels in alignment, that allows you to make one. That's what I feel like. Would you be able to explain more about that and the alignment and how to come to alignment?
Yeah, absolutely. So this has been a core part of my research for probably the last 12 years. And when I talk about the brain and body, I do talk about it from a biological perspective. So when we look at the brain and body, it is connected as a structure which is analogous to a tree. So if you can imagine the hemispheres of the brain as the branches of a tree, it has all this, branching structures which are similar to the branching of the neurons. And then you have a trunk of the tree, which is similar to the brain stem or the stem of a tree. And then you have a root structure in a tree, and the root structure is analogous to the spinal cord. So our body is the spinal cord is basically the root structure for the brain. And basically, what I often talk about is that if you don't nurture the soil, you cannot expect the branches to flourish. So this connection that I talk about in brain and body is biological, and it can be measured, and we measure it through heart rate variability. And that gives us a proxy for what is known as vagal tone. In science, we say high vagal tone is strong connection between brain and body, and low vagal tone is weak connection between brain and body. And it's very obvious in individuals. So you can simply see that in individuals who have low vagal tone, they often have a myriad of diseases, both physical, physiological, and psychological. They also have, various forms of difficulty with, say, chronic fatigue, like tiredness, hyperexertion. They are often quite frazzled. So all of these things show that, the mind is sort of like running wild, and they're completely checked out of their bodies. So it's obvious symptomatically, but it is also measurable using heart rate variability devices.
Interesting, man. Interesting. And look, I think that a lot of this stuff you would, again, like in my mind, there are many ways of saying similar things without necessarily delving too deeply into, I guess, the meat of discussion one way or another, right? Whether you are coming from a very Western logical, rational type way of thinking versus like an Eastern way of thinking as well, right? Like to me, I understand I study and understand both sides of things, and I think it's important to take what resonates with oneself from any any school of thought or information or school of knowledge, right? And for me, when you're talking about, I guess, this alignment and state, it sort of reminds me of, like, I guess, when initially, like, the thought around meditation is really to, I guess, return oneself to, like, this foundational state of stillness, which to me is that alignment piece, right? And it gives you the opportunity to then have more sense of clarity, and be able to make more conscious decisions that are less influenced by external factors, and potentially also see things that are potentially influenced by subconscious factors, right? Is that similar to, like, a similar concept, but, like, I guess, told from a different way of thinking or school of thought?
Meditation is great, and I have practiced it for many, many years. But meditation, in my view, is by itself not enough. Because if you simply meditate, then you get negating all the aspects of the body, and so you're only using half your potential. So to unlock all of that capacity of the body, you have to work directly with the body to do that. And if what you're doing is simply working on the body, then you're ignoring the mental landscape. So even there can be a disconnect. So you can do all the right things in the world, but if it is not connecting brain and body, then you're only working one aspect and negating the other. So I do, elaborate on the fact that to connect brain and body is one of the best ways of enhancing performance, for example. Whether it be mental performance, physical performance, everything works much better when there's coherence within the body.
And in terms of working on the body, right? You mentioned the heart rate variability and vagal tone. Are there things people can do before? Because I imagine, measuring your heart rate variability and then your vagal tone is something that, requires equipment and things like that. Are there things people can do, I guess, practically before those measures to start to work on the body to then come towards forming the mind and body connection?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's actually very, very simple. The way to modulate your heart rate is through your breath. And there is a very intimate relationship between your breathing and your heart rate. So every time you inhale, the heart rate rises, and every time you exhale, the heart rate slows down. And by modulating the frequency of that, you have direct control over your heart rate. And one of the things that I also want to mention is that breath by itself is not enough, because you need some form of external feedback to show you that, in case of any challenges, you are able to maintain a calm and relaxed state. So if you simply do breathing and expect it to work in real life scenarios, quite often it fails without any feedback. So a lot of the training that I do combines breath with stress inoculation, fear conditioning, and various ways of progressive loading of the stress, so that an individual's capacity to deal with stress increases incrementally, but without them knowing, because the inoculation is so insignificant that they don't know that training is happening. So this form of training is called implicit learning, and it's one of the ways that I heighten the brain-body connection.
And when you say feedback, what sort of feedback are you looking for?
So feedback can be mental, emotional, even physical feedback. So the measure that I'm looking for in any challenge is what a person's breathing is doing and what the person's heart rate is doing. So regardless of any tasks that are set, for me, it's not important for the person to complete the task. What is important from my perspective is how much their heart rate changes. And so, often say, for example, in fitness, it's all about pushing yourself and, exhausting yourself, like hitting that last rep, and, that makes you stronger. But in my case, what I look at is what your heart rate is doing. And over time, because we incrementally increase the amount of stress, you're able to gain a stronger capacity in a much shorter time, but without the, the side effects that come from pushing yourself too hard.
Right. Look, and I'm sure like a lot of this and what you've talked about and like to this point, to I guess the work that you do now, it sort of stemmed from many, personal experiences, through your own personal growth, as you said. But a very interesting one that I'd love for you to, I guess, share with the audience, surrounds, the I guess the birthing of your first book, mate. So I'd love for you to tell us a little bit more about that particular experience and how it came, to culminate into the book, and tell us more about what that that journey was and what the book, how the book encompasses it, essentially.
Yeah, so my first book, Hidden World, Inside Story of the Soul, was written quite differently to how I've written previously. When I started writing this book, it was January 2016, and I'd written about 3 chapters, and it came from a space of not trying to write, but I just had this, I guess, intention or drive to write for no reason. I wasn't writing to, for this book to go anywhere. It was just coming out of me. And once I had written 3 chapters, I realized that this was actually horrible. There was no character development. There was no plot that I had, given much thought to. It was simply writing. And at that point, I realized that if I was to do this properly, I would need some dedicated time to devote to this. So at that point, so that was in January. By March, I had already decided to go to Thailand, and I packed up in Sydney, and pretty much my life came to a standstill, and I moved to Thailand for about 8 months, and that is where I wrote my book. And part of that journey also involved me living inside a cave. And the cave was quite remote up in Thailand. And quite often I wouldn't see a single soul for many, many days. And I'd go to a resort that was nearby every few days to gather water. And I had food supplies that I had gathered from a neighboring island. So that is what was sustaining me within the cave. And to write in a place which is immersed in nature meant that there was nothing contaminating my mind. I didn't have, social media. I didn't have anyone to talk to. I was alone with my own thoughts. And so that meant over time, the purity of my own thoughts emerged. And that is the state from which I wrote my book. So it's entirely my own thoughts. So I didn't do any research, which was one of the criteria for writing this book. So anytime I wrote something I already knew, I deleted that. I wanted to write from a place of not knowing, so that I wasn't regurgitating information that I had already applied.
Yeah, amazing, man. And how long were you in that cave for? And also, I'd like to, like, you know, just ask you, man, like, what was the motivation to I guess stay in that and live in that particular way?
Yeah, so the whole process of living in the cave just happened. I didn't go out and decide to live in a cave. All I wanted to do was write a book. And to be honest, Thailand would have been one of the last places I would have considered writing a book. Before I went to Thailand, in my mind, I was like, I don't even like Thailand. Why am I going to Thailand? So when I did arrive, because I was there for a specific purpose, I did not go to any of the parties, anything like that. I was so focused on writing this book, and I completed it within 2 months. And after writing the last chapter, I knew something was missing. So I stayed on the island and started connecting with people, and someone was already living in that cave, and he was another author. And we developed, I guess, a bit of a kinship because we were two authors on the same mission on the same island. And when he was leaving, he basically handed over the custodianship of the cave to me. And so that's how that happened. And so when I arrived in the cave, I already had some, ideas about how to live in a cave. I thought I'd, set up a gym apparatus in the cave and continue working out and all these sort of Western ways of, functioning. But the cave rejected all of that very quickly. So even though I was trying to set up gymnastic rings in there, that wasn't really what the, energy of the cave was. So I had to give up a lot of what I was pushing onto the cave to be able to live in that environment. And that allowed me to harmonize with nature. And a lot of my biological rhythms started to change in response to living in nature. So that was probably, in a way, the most purest state I've ever lived in. And for that reason, it's been one of the heights of my human experience.
Yeah, amazing, man. I mean, I can somewhat resonate with your experience because I myself, I've done a vision quest, 3 nights, 3 days, 3 nights out in the wilderness with fasting from everything, food, just water and nothing else really. And I understand. I guess there is like a somewhat a rite of passage, a type of energy to that type of experience, right? And I think that sort of the vision quest itself is born from traditional tribal people where they transition from one stage of life to another. And I too felt a very big shift in who I was and an emergence of some sort after the experience. And I imagine you did as well, especially the length of time you would have stayed in that cave by yourself as well. So no, it sounds like an amazing experience, and one that definitely seems like it happened all for the right reasons, and it was supposed to happen, I suppose, because it wasn't something that you necessarily planned at all. So it's a super cool experience. And how long did you actually end up staying in that cave for?
Yeah, I was in that cave for around 3 months. And I like that you picked up on the fact that it just happened. because you can't simply just jump on Airbnb and look for a cave and suddenly you have a, and of course there are caves which are hired out as Airbnb places, but the cost is phenomenal on those well-built areas. So staying there for 3 months meant that first of all, I wasn't really paying any rent. You can't, like, Mother Nature doesn't charge you for existence. So those sorts of ways of just being was so phenomenal in being able to have all the time in the world to articulate ideas and come back to that craftsmanship that I was talking about, so that I could disassemble everything I knew and put it into words that I had not yet thought of.
Yeah, and I think, look, like you said, a lot of what it like sort of just draws me to is like these two notions of simplicity and purity, right? I mean, when we take ourselves away from an environment that is, I guess, like any sort of metropolis that is inherently so full of external influence and stimulus, it is very difficult to, and that's, I guess that's inherently complex as well, right? But it's so difficult for us to really understand for ourselves where our thoughts are coming from, whether they have some sort of, acute influence from some particular place, or whether it's purely from a place within. So those sorts of simple and I guess grounding environments are where the most pure thoughts can have the opportunity to arise if you simply allow them to.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's quite interesting in that when you are by yourself, away from everything else, the true origins of your own ideas start to emerge. And I guess the first time I had an experience of this was when I traveled straight through the middle of Australia. I started in Sydney, drove to Melbourne through the Great Ocean Road to Adelaide, and then I drove straight up the middle, past Cooper Pedy, past Alice Springs, through the Kimberleys, through Kakadu National Park, and eventually in Darwin. And that journey took me about 3.5 months to complete. And in that time, I was, again, quite young, probably 24 years old, by myself in the middle of the desert. And extended periods of time by myself has probably been one of the greatest things, because then when I am in society, I can see, where people are coming from, whether they're coming from their own thoughts or whether the thoughts are manipulated by other aspects of their life. So having that clarity has been so beautiful in being able to, I guess, filter people and set boundaries where necessary.
And so after I'm really interested to know what life was like for you directly after you left the cave. You just mentioned this filter, but what was it like right after, and how did life change for you as you came back, I guess, into, modern society from a cave?
Yeah, that's a very amazing question to ask, because it wasn't easy. It took me about 10 months to reintegrate back into society after that. And simply living within 4 walls was one of the most unusual things. Prior to living in a cave, I had never really lived in an apartment before. I'd always lived in a house and had a backyard and things like that. So to come back to Sydney, live inside an apartment and be enclosed within 4 walls was quite, it felt quite threatening, actually. And it took me at least 10 months to even get used to that. And living in the city, of course, people are running around, being busy, doing what they think needs to be done. And of course, there are a lot of things that need to be done in a city. But I've never really returned back to that pace. So I still maintain the pace that I had while living in nature. And that means that everything I do might seem 10 times longer, but at the same time, because I'm so present and so intentional with what I do end up doing things a lot faster than spending meaningless time doing things that are unnecessary.
Yeah, and I think that many people will talk about, any sort of experience that is similar to the one that you went through, whether it's, a vision quest or living a solitary living, or, even like a DMT experience or anything like this, that sort of challenges old paradigms of thought. When you return back, there is also and for me anyway, every time I've experienced one of these things, the most difficult thing hasn't necessarily been the experience itself, but the integration back into a place that I guess is no longer what you thought it was, I suppose, or no longer represents the values and principles that you now hold and feel that represent you more purely and I guess are less corrupt, right? That integration part is quite difficult. So what are the things that you sort of did for yourself in assisting yourself to come back to I guess civilized life, if you want to call it that?
Yeah, great question. And you're right, integrating back into the real world is quite the challenge. For me, I felt like when I came back, because I had experienced something so different, I wasn't really integrating back into society. And what it took was actually falling apart. I became quite lonely. Even though at that time I was in a relationship, I felt like I wasn't being understood, and it took a decent slap on the face, going, "Hey, in order to reintegrate back into society, you have to sort of start behaving like the people around you." So after about a year from returning back, I started working, and I did not mention a thing about the experiences that I had. I parked those experiences. I started working as a project manager for implementing an AI workforce into the clinical workflow at Sydney Uni. And that required, a lot of project management teams that were across 4 other countries, and working with AI scientists, clinicians, stakeholders. So I was very immersed in the real world. And that, I think, has been a blessing in disguise, because now I have, I guess, this privilege of integrating both aspects into my life. So I'm not swayed by one or the other. And when I do speak about science or spirituality, I'm not aligned with either, because that is where this internal alignment comes in. I'm not swayed by, the latest trends in spirituality or the latest breakthroughs in science. I already have an inner knowing around that. So it also means that I have the luxury of traversing both worlds. And in the past, as I mentioned, I used to have an internal conflict existing in one or the other. I don't anymore. I feel like I've now integrated both worlds, so they're no longer in conflict.
And there's one thing that I wanted to switch gears and ask you about, which is just intriguing me, that came up in your bio, which is you've written a children's book. And I would love to ask you about that and what your motivation was to write a children's book, especially given your, wealth of knowledge and detailed understanding of what are really, really, I guess, complex areas of understanding. And, I guess you're not really talking about neuroscience and things to children, but I'd love to know where that motivation came from for you and what really was the driver for you to do that.
Yeah, so that's again an incredible question, because I never intended to write a children's book, and I have a YouTube channel called Primal Heart, and on that channel I seek out individuals who I believe are the best at what they do, and not only do I hear their story, but I also ask them to put me through a challenge so that I get to experience what made them, basically. And so when in one of the episodes, I contacted a guy called Dave Pau Tabane. He's the three times world kettlebell champion. And I was hoping to do a kettlebell challenge. And when I was interviewing him, we came across the story that, I had been bullied in my childhood. And so Dave kind of switched the script on me, and he said, anyone can do a kettlebell challenge, and it's very boring and repetitive. Let's do something a little bit more meaningful. And one of the other things that Dave does is he talks to kids about bullying, and he frequently goes to schools and connects with kids, and he's the author of 3 best-selling kids books. And so he challenged me to write a book instead of just doing a kettlebell challenge. And so in the course of about 6 months, we worked together into putting this kids book into creation. And one of the things that really came through was when I migrated from my home country of Fiji to New Zealand. I did so under political crisis. And I had no intention of going to New Zealand. I just suddenly happened to arrive there. And it was a process integrating into that culture. And when I was writing this kids book, I thought about what kids are facing when they migrate into a new country. And it's often not because of, just going to a new country, but it's because of poverty back home, or political unrest, or civil war. They're refugees. And so I dedicated this book to kids who are coming from an underprivileged environment into a privileged country, and to not only negotiate bullying, but actually how to integrate and how to make friends in that new environment. So it is actually targeted to kids, foreign kids in Western culture. And other than sort of like sharing my own story in it, which has sort of a comical element to it, it has a much more deeper meaning. And even though it's written in kids' language, there are actually exercises in there which kids can do in order to make new friends and be more comfortable in a new environment.
And just thinking about the fact that that's how that journey came about for you to write the book, is you got your YouTube channel, You know, you thought you were going to be doing a kettlebell challenge and you ended up writing a children's book. It's incredible. You know, you went to Thailand, to a place that you didn't even really like, and you ended up living in a cave and having one of the most meaningful experiences of your life, living in a cave. Sounds to me like, you know, you have a very fluid approach to life, and you really allow things to happen for you. And you mentioned, you know, not being in a camp of anything, or, you know, being too committed to any of those things like science or spirituality, or leaning too far into one of them. And could you talk a bit more about where you feel this fluidity comes from? You mentioned when you were young, you questioned a lot, but it feels like, you know, you've got this element of surrender, and then really of deep exploration, and you're really open to things. So do you know where that comes from for you?
Yeah, absolutely. So you nailed it there. I do it from the outside. It does feel like, you know, all of these random things are happening. Perhaps one of the most random things that had happened recently is I ended up making a music video with a hip hop artist, and the way this happened was I did a talk at a music festival 2 years ago, and there were about 150 people in the audience, and they were all sort of, you know, in the 18 to 22 age bracket, so very young, and high on, you know, whatever, you know, drugs that were available at the festival. But one of the kids approached me afterwards, and we had a conversation. And what was interesting was that December last year, so December 2020, I was walking down Bondi Beach, and this kid suddenly appears in front of me, and he starts yelling sort of "Lost Paradise," and I'm like, what are you talking about? And then he took my memory back to this music festival where I gave the talk, and he was the one who had approached me at the end of the talk. And so this time we exchanged details, contact details, and we started hanging out and just sort of talking about life with no agenda. And the like at that time, I was also contemplating this idea called equation of love. I didn't really know whether it would be a book or a new poem or something along those lines. But when we started talking about it, it occurred to us that this could be a really great song. And so we collaborated on producing this song. I sort of gave him the idea of how I wanted this song to be structured, how I wanted it to be you know, emphasized, and then he wrote the song and he came up with the beat. And it was so phenomenal that I gathered a team together and directed and produced a music video called Equation of Love. And it is so far from, you know, who I am. I'm not an artist. I have very little skills in music. Directing, producing a music video from scratch, that takes, you know, quite a bit of organizing to do, but it is quite an amazing music video. And so when it comes to you know, how I operate and why do these things happen, it's got nothing to do with what I want, actually. Quite often it's the opposite of what I want. And for me, because I'm not attached to anything external, it does not mean that I'm not attached to anything at all. Instead, I'm fully devoted to my heart. And because that has been a constant conviction well over 13 years, when things do arrive and my heart senses things, I go, okay, that's what I need to do. And also the other side effect of that is that when I do talks, when I I share the knowledge and information that I do, people resonate with it. And the people that do resonate with it are often connected to their own hearts. And so these people, find me somehow and beautiful things happen. So I never plan any of this. It just happens. I never planned writing a book in a cave. I never planned making a music video. I never planned living in a cave. And yet, when you are so authentic with your message and who you are, these things happen inevitably.
Yeah, man. I mean, I think a really nice way for you to sort of paint that picture, and I guess when you mentioned not being in one camp or another, and not sort of flying any external flag but your own, I think that's a really powerful image, and I think that almost paints like what people might refer to when you're acting from a place like that is more in harmony, holistically, whether you're talking about the mind-body connection, whatever it is, like spiritual, scientific, like intellectual, sensual, there's like a sense of harmony there that's sort of like, and I think that you have to be open to it and allow it, and like almost get out of your own way from an intellectual standpoint, like, sort of rise and transcend above this way of thinking that is simply logical, simply rational, and like you said, if you open yourself up and like operate from a place of such authenticity and truth, then you may not plan these beautiful things, but the most wondrous and miraculous things will occur in your life. So I think that's like a wonderful place to sort of leave the conversation with the audience to have a think about, in terms of, this more openness to life in general, and allowing it to sort of give us the indicators through our hearts as to what might be what it might be that we are sort of here to do, and to put into action, and to manifest with our hands and hearts. So thanks so much for joining us today on the show, Kaushik, and I'd love to give you the opportunity to give the audience a little taste about what you're currently working on, where they can find you, and anything else like this. So floor is yours, man.
Yeah, thanks, Leslie. So yeah, it is. We have covered a lot in this podcast, and I guess the theme that I'd really like people to walk away with is that there are ways to connect with your heart. And if you're out there and trying to figure this out yourself, it might take years, sometimes even decades, to be able to do that. So always seek help, especially if you're troubled with mental disorders, illnesses. There is always help around, and often in these situations, because the oxytocin levels are depleted, people are less likely to trust and to ask for help. And that is, in those moments, that is exactly the time that they actually do need to ask for help. So that is one thing. And I do offer programs of how to connect with your heart and how to align your business, your vision, and what you want with that as well. So that program is called the Precognition Method, and you can find me on all the social media networks. Perhaps the easiest way is just to Google my name, Kaushik Ram, and my website will come up, which has a lot of resources, my books, as well as online courses and ways to connect with me directly. So yeah, perhaps Google is the easiest way, and I'm available on Instagram, Facebook, with the handle Dr. Kaushik Ram.
Awesome, man. And definitely put all those links in the show notes, and also might try and dig up the video, the music video, and put the link up there as well so people can watch that. Shaun, where can people find you, man?
Yeah, easiest place to find me is actually on Instagram, just Shaun_Coop, SHAUN_COOP. And you can also find the two of us at true-north.co, the website there, which can tell you a bit more about what we're doing with that work. And where can people find you, Les?
Yeah, you can find me on my website, fightingspace.co. All my latest programs and offerings will be on there. So if you want to send me a message through there, feel free to do so. And again, on Facebook and Instagram, it's the same handle, fightingspace.co.
And Kaushik, I'd just like to take a moment to thank you as well for joining us today. You're such an interesting man, and I think it's incredibly interesting that a neuroscientist, in his own words, is completely devoted to the heart and following that. It's amazing. And yeah, it's going to be really interesting for those of us that follow you to see where your life leads, and more so where you're leading yourself. I think it's going to be really cool to see. And, you know, it was a really enjoyable conversation today. And people that are listening, if you enjoyed the conversation, took some nuggets from it, we ask that you just share it with one other person. And until next time, guys, thanks for joining us.
See you guys.
Wonderful. Thanks so much.